Hello everyone and welcome back to Nocturnal Narrative Studio. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know which country you're listening from. Without further ado, let's begin the story. I've been driving trucks for 23 years. Coast to coast, north to south, I've seen it all. Or at least I thought I had until 3 months ago. It started on a routine haul from Albuquerque to Chicago. I was on I-40 East, somewhere in the Oklahoma Panhandle. It was about 3 a.m., that dead time of night when the highway belongs to long haulers and the occasional insomniac in a sedan. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show about conspiracy theories, the kind of background noise that keeps you company without demanding attention. I glanced at my rear-view mirror, something I do automatically every few minutes. That's when I first saw it, a dark figure sitting in the sleeper berth behind me. I nearly swerved off the road. I hit the brakes, pulled onto the shoulder, and whipped around to confront whatever stowaway had managed to get into my locked cab. Nothing. The berth was empty. I searched the entire cab with my flashlight, checked under the bunk, in the storage compartments, everywhere a person could possibly hide. Nothing. I chalked it up to highway hypnosis, the kind of hallucination that comes from too many hours on empty roads. I splashed some cold water on my face at the next rest stop and doubled up on coffee, but it happened again the next night, and the night after that, always the same. A dark, humanoid shape sitting perfectly still in my sleeper berth, visible only in the rearview mirror. Always. At night, always when I was alone on some desolate stretch of highway. And always gone when I turned around to look directly. After a week of this, I mentioned it to some other drivers at a truck stop outside of Tulsa. I expected them to laugh, to tell me I needed more sleep or less caffeine. Instead, the table went quiet. One by one, they started sharing similar stories. Saw it first about 2 months ago, said Mike, a veteran driver I'd known for years. Thought I was losing my mind. Mine wears a hat, added Darlene, who runs the Dallas-Denver route. Like an old-fashioned fedora. But otherwise, yeah, same thing. Only in the mirror, never when you turn around. They all had one thing in common. Their sightings began after driving a newly opened stretch of I-40 that cuts through the western Oklahoma Panhandle. The shortcut, they called it, a 40-mile stretch that shaved almost an hour off the usual route. It had opened about 6 months ago, after years of delays and protests from local indigenous groups who claimed the land was an ancient burial site. Jenkins saw it too, Mike said quietly. Started posting about it in the driver's forum. Jenkins? I asked. Bill Jenkins? Haven't seen him around lately. The table went quiet again. Highway Patrol found his rig abandoned on the shoulder of the shortcut about 3 weeks ago, Darlene finally said. No sign of him. Engine running, doors locked from the inside. His dash cam was still recording when they found it. What was on it? I asked, though something told me I didn't want to know. Department won't release the footage, Mike said. But my cousin works dispatch for the state troopers. Says the official report mentions unexplained visual anomalies on the recording. Jenkins wasn't the only one. Over the next few days, I heard about 3 other drivers who had disappeared in the last 6 months. All after reporting seeing figures in their mirrors. All their trucks found abandoned along the same stretch of highway. I should have requested a different route. Should have told my dispatcher I wouldn't drive the shortcut anymore. But 23 years of pride and stubbornness don't disappear overnight. Instead, I decided to document what was happening. I set up a dash cam facing forward and a small camera on my visor pointing back into the cab. If I was going crazy, I wanted proof. If I wasn't, well, I wasn't sure what I'd do with that proof, but it seemed important to have it. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The cameras seemed to keep the phenomenon at bay, and I started to think maybe it had all been in my head after all. Then came the 4th night. I was eastbound on the shortcut around 2 a.m. No other vehicles in sight, just the endless ribbon of highway illuminated by my headlights. I glanced at the rearview mirror out of habit, and my blood turned to ice. It was back. The dark figure sat in my sleeper berth, more distinct than I'd ever seen it before. It looked like a man, but with features that were somehow wrong, too angular, too still. And this time I could make out eyes, not human eyes. Just dark hollows that somehow still managed to convey they were looking directly at me. I forced myself to keep driving, to not react. The cameras were running. I would have proof. When I reached my destination the next morning, I immediately checked the footage. The forward-facing dash cam showed nothing unusual, just hours of empty highway. I turned to the interior camera with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The first few hours were just me, driving alone in the cab. Then at exactly 2:17 a.m., something changed. There was a subtle darkening in the sleeper berth, like a shadow gradually deepening. By 2:20, it had taken the shape I'd seen in my mirror. It sat there, unmoving, for exactly 37 minutes. Then it simply faded away. I watched the footage 3 times, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a camera malfunction, anything rational. But there it was, undeniable. That night, I called Mike. "I got it on camera," I told him. "The figure, it's real." There was a long pause before he responded. "Darlene's gone," he said finally. "Truck found on the shortcut yesterday morning, same as the others." My mouth went dry. "Did they check her cameras?" "That's the thing," Mike said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "State trooper who found her rig watched the footage on site. Said he saw something that made him quit the force the same day. Wouldn't tell anyone what it was. The footage is missing now." I decided then and there I wasn't taking the shortcut again. I'd add hours to my route if necessary, but curiosity is a powerful force, and that night I found myself reviewing my footage again. I noticed something I'd missed before. I pulled up the recording from 2 nights earlier, the first night I'd run the cameras. There was something there. After all, just the faintest shadow in the berth, barely perceptible. The next night's footage showed it slightly more distinct, and in last night's recording it was fully formed. It was getting stronger, more visible, more present. But there was something else, something that made my skin crawl. I measured the distance between the figure and my seat using landmarks in the cab. In the first recording, it sat at the very back of the berth. In the second, it was a few inches closer. And in last night's footage, it was at least a foot closer to me. It was moving forward, night by night. I called every driver I knew who had mentioned seeing the figure. Most didn't answer. Those who did hadn't driven the shortcut recently. They'd heard the rumors about the missing drivers and changed their routes. I spent hours researching the land where the shortcut had been built. The protest hadn't made national news, but local papers covered them extensively. The Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes had fought the construction for years, claiming the highway would cut through a sacred burial ground dating back centuries. Archaeological surveys found some evidence of human remains, but not enough to halt construction. The highway department rerouted around the most significant sites and proceeded with the project. There was one quote that kept coming back to me, from an elder who had led the protests. "Some things should remain undisturbed. Some journeys were never meant to be shortened." I requested routes that kept me far from Oklahoma. My dispatcher wasn't happy, but I insisted. For 2 weeks, I stayed away from the shortcut, running hauls up and down the East Coast instead. The figure didn't appear in my mirror again. I started to relax, to think maybe the connection to that stretch of highway was real, and as long as I stayed away, I'd be safe. Then came the call from Mike's wife. He'd taken a route through Oklahoma last week. His truck was found on the shortcut 3 days ago. I shouldn't have done it. Every instinct told me to stay away. But Mike was my friend. 20 years of sharing meals at truck stops, helping each other through divorces and health scares and all the loneliness of the long-haul life. I couldn't just do nothing. So I took a run to Oklahoma. Not a delivery, just a personal trip in my pickup. I had to see the shortcut for myself in daylight, had to understand what was happening there. The highway looked ordinary enough. Fresh asphalt, new guardrails, the usual signage. But there was an emptiness to it. Despite being a more direct route, there was noticeably less traffic than the old highway. I pulled over at a historical marker near the eastern end of the shortcut. It gave a sanitized history of the area, mentioning the indigenous peoples who had once lived there, but nothing about the burial grounds or the protests. As I was reading, an old pickup truck pulled up beside me. A native man in his 70s got out and stood looking at me for a long moment. "You're one of the truck drivers," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "You've seen them," he continued. "The shadow people." "What are they?" I asked. He gazed out at the highway. "When you build roads through burial grounds, you disturb more than bones. You cut through the pathways the dead use to travel to the next world. Some get lost, some get angry." "The missing drivers," I began. "They took the shortcut in life," he said simply. "Now they walk the longer road in death." He wouldn't say more, just got back in his truck and drove away. That night in a motel room 50 miles from the shortcut, I reviewed all the footage again. I noticed something new in the last recording, something I'd missed before. The figure had raised its hand slightly, reaching toward me. I checked the missing persons reports for the area. In the past 6 months, 7 long-haul truckers had disappeared along that stretch. 7. All experienced drivers with clean records. I packed up and headed home the next morning, taking the long way around Oklahoma entirely. I told myself I was done with this, that I'd request permanent routes that kept me far from the shortcut. But last night in my own bedroom 3 states away from Oklahoma, I caught a glimpse of something in my bathroom mirror as I was brushing my teeth. A dark figure standing in the hallway behind me. When I turned around, the hallway was empty. I'm writing this all down now because I need someone to know what happened, what's still happening. I've set up cameras in my house. If what I suspect is true, the recordings will show the figure getting closer each night. I understand now why the missing drivers' trucks were found abandoned with the doors locked from the inside. There was nowhere to run, no escape from what was coming for them from behind. Tonight I won't look in any mirrors. I won't turn around. But I can feel it there already. A cold presence at my back, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Some shortcuts, it turns out, lead to much longer journeys. Love the story? Show us with a like, hit that subscribe button, and share your scariest idea in the comments. And don't forget to tell us the time and where you're listening from. We want to know where the fear is spreading. The house on Blackwood Lane had been vacant for nearly a decade when I bought it. The real estate agent called it a historic gem with untapped potential, code for needs extensive renovation. But the price was right, and at 35, I was ready to put down roots after years of apartment living. Built in 1897, the Victorian-style home had the architectural charm I'd always admired: ornate woodwork, high ceilings, bay windows that caught the morning light. Yes, the wallpaper was peeling, the floors needed refinishing, and the plumbing was questionable at best. But I saw beyond these flaws to what the house could become. "You're either brave or crazy, Adam," my sister said when she helped me move. "Tourist, this place is going to swallow your life for the next year." She wasn't wrong. I'd taken a remote position specifically to accommodate the renovation schedule, converting the smallest bedroom into a home office where I could work as a software developer between construction projects. The first 3 months passed in a blur of contractors, dust, and decisions about paint colors. We modernized the kitchen, updated the electrical system, and refinished the original hardwood floors to a warm honey glow that transformed the main level. The house was beginning to feel like mine. Then came the basement. Unlike the rest of the house, the basement had a distinctly uninviting quality. Low ceilings, stone foundation walls, and a dirt floor that had been haphazardly covered with concrete in some areas. My contractor, Mike, suggested a proper renovation: waterproofing, new concrete throughout, better lighting. "While we're at it," he said, examining the space, "we should figure out what's behind this wall. It doesn't make sense with the footprint of the house." He pointed to the north wall, which did indeed seem too close compared to the dimensions above. According to the original blueprints we'd found in the county records office, the basement should have extended another 12 feet in that direction. "Could be filled in," Mike suggested. Old houses like this, sometimes they'd section off part of the basement if there were structural issues they didn't want to deal with. We decided to investigate. And the next day, Mike's crew began carefully removing a section of the stone wall. Behind it, we discovered another wall, this one made of brick more recent than the original construction. Someone really wanted to seal this off, Mike observed, pointing to the thick mortar between bricks. This wasn't done by the original builders. By late afternoon, they'd created an opening large enough to pass through. Mike shone his flashlight into the space beyond, then turned to me with a puzzled expression. "You're gonna want to see this, Adam." I stepped forward and peered through the opening. The beam of Mike's flashlight illuminated a room roughly 12 feet square, with the same stone foundation walls as the main basement. The floor was packed earth, undisturbed for what must have been decades. The space was entirely empty except for a single object in the center, a child's wooden rocking chair, small and delicate, coated in a thick layer of dust. "That's odd," I said, unable to articulate the unease that suddenly washed over me. "No kidding," Mike agreed. "Why would someone wall up a perfectly good room with nothing in it but a kid's chair?" We enlarged the opening and stepped inside. The air was stale but surprisingly dry. No signs of water damage or mold, which was unusual for a basement of this age. The chair was hand-carved oak, probably from the early 1900s, with a faded cushion tied to the seat. It seemed frozen in time, undisturbed since the room had been sealed. "Should we take it out?" one of the workers asked. I hesitated, though I couldn't have explained why. "Let's leave it for now. We need to finish the opening and make sure this space is structurally sound before we decide what to do with it." By the end of the day, we had a clean opening between the main basement and the sealed room. Mike's team installed temporary lighting and promised to return the next day to inspect the foundation and begin integrating the space into the overall basement renovation. That night, I found myself thinking about the chair. Why had it been left behind when the room was sealed? Why seal the room at all? The house's history, according to county records, was unremarkable. A succession of families over the decades, none staying more than 15 or 20 years. None with any documented tragedies or unusual circumstances. I fell asleep pondering these questions, only to awaken at 3:17 a.m. to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. I lay still, listening. There it was again, a soft scraping noise like something being dragged slowly across a rough surface. It was coming from below, from the basement. I told myself it was the house settling, or perhaps a small animal that had found its way inside. Old houses made noises, that was simply a fact. But as I lay there, the scraping continued, now accompanied by a soft rhythmic creaking, the rocking chair. I sat up, heart pounding. The logical part of my brain offered explanations. Air currents from the newly opened room, an uneven floor causing the chair to rock slightly, the natural expansion and contraction of old wood in response to temperature changes. But none of these explained the scraping sound, which continued intermittently between the creaking. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight app. The hardwood floors were cold beneath my bare feet as I made my way downstairs. At the basement door, I hesitated, listening. The sounds had stopped. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, and opened the door. The basement stairs creaked under my weight. I swept my phone's light across the space, illuminating the newly exposed brick around the opening to the sealed room. Everything appeared exactly as we had left it. I approached the opening cautiously, playing my light into the room beyond. The chair sat undisturbed in the center, exactly as it had been that afternoon. I was about to turn back when my light caught something on the earthen floor, a disturbance in the dust, a series of marks leading from the chair to the opening, then out into the main basement. They weren't footprints, at least not human ones. They looked more like drag marks, as if something had pulled itself across the floor. I followed the marks with my light. They continued across the main basement floor toward the stairs, toward me, before disappearing about halfway across the space. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I took an involuntary step backward, bumping into the wall. My phone slipped from my suddenly numb fingers, clattering to the floor where it bounced once and went dark. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard it again. The scraping sound, closer now, somewhere in the main basement, and something else. a soft, wet sound like moist fabric being pulled across stone. I fumbled blindly for my phone, fingers scrabbling against the cold concrete. When I finally grasped it and reactivated the light, I swept the beam in a panicked arc across the basement. For a brief moment, I caught sight of something, a low, dark shape near the far wall, something that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Then it was gone, retreating into the shadows beyond the reach of my light. I backed up the stairs, unwilling to turn my back on the darkness below. Once through the door, I slammed it shut and leaned against it, breathing heavily. "House settling," I said aloud, trying to convince myself. Old pipes, imagination working overtime. But I knew what I had seen, or at least what I thought I had seen. Something dark and formless, something that moved. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, waiting for dawn, trying to rationalize what had happened. By morning, in the reassuring light of day, I had almost convinced myself it had been nothing more than a half-waking dream, a product of stress and an overactive imagination. When Mike and his crew arrived, I considered telling them about the disturbances in the dust, the sounds, the glimpsed shape. But what would I say? That I thought my basement was haunted? That would go over well. Instead, I casually suggested we remove the rocking chair. "Sure thing," Mike said. "You want to keep it? Might clean up nice." "No," I said quickly. "I'd rather it was gone." Mike gave me an odd look, but nodded. One of his workers carefully picked up the chair and carried it upstairs and out to their truck, leaving behind a perfect circle in the dust where it had sat for decades. Throughout the day, I found myself glancing toward the basement door, half expecting to hear the scraping sound again, but the house remained silent except for the normal noises of construction. That evening, after the crew had left, I forced myself to go down to the basement, this time with a proper flashlight. I examined the room that had been sealed, now empty without the chair. The earthen floor showed only the footprints of the workers and the circular impression where the chair had been. In the main basement, I found no trace of the drag marks I'd seen the night before. The concrete floor was dusty but undisturbed except for our footprints. I began to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. As I turned to go back upstairs, my flashlight beam caught something on the stone foundation wall, a dark smudge about 2 feet off the floor. I moved closer to examine it. It wasn't a water stain or mold. It looked more like a sooty handprint, but elongated and misshapen, with what appeared to be too many fingers, each unnaturally thin. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It hadn't been there the day before, I was certain of that. I would have noticed it during the renovation discussions. A sudden noise from the sealed room made me jump, a soft thud, as if something had fallen. I swung my flashlight toward the opening, heart racing. Nothing. The room was empty. I backed toward the stairs, unwilling to investigate further. Whatever was happening, I didn't want to face it alone in the growing darkness. That night, I called my sister. "I need to research the history of my house," I told her, beyond what was in the disclosure and county records. "Why?" she asked. "Did you find something?" I hesitated. "Maybe. There was a sealed room in the basement with a child's rocking chair. Just feels like there might be more to the story." "Creepy," she agreed. "Have you checked newspaper archives? The Historical Society might have information the real estate records don't." The next day, I took a break from work and drove to the local Historical Society. The archivist, an elderly woman named Mrs. Pembroke, was intrigued by my address. "The old Whitaker place," she said, nodding. "Yes, there's quite a bit about that house in our archives, though not all of it pleasant." She disappeared into the back rooms and returned with several folders and a bound volume of local newspaper archives. "The house was built by Thomas Whitaker in 1897, she explained, opening the first folder. "He lived there with his wife Eleanor and eventually their son James, born in 1904. She showed me a faded photograph of the family standing in front of the house, a stern-looking man with a mustache, a woman in a high-necked dress, and between them, a solemn-faced boy of about 6. "What happened to them?" I asked. Mrs. Pembroke's expression grew somber. There was a tragedy in 1912. James disappeared. The circumstances were unusual. She opened the bound volume of newspapers to a marked page. The headline read, "Local boy missing. Parents make disturbing claims." I scanned the article, my unease growing with each paragraph. 8-year-old James Whitaker had vanished from the family home on Blackwood Lane. His parents claimed he had been taken by something they described as dark and formless, that they had seen crawling across the floor of their son's bedroom. The article went on to report that no evidence of forced entry or foul play had been found. The authorities suspected the parents themselves might be responsible for the boy's disappearance, though no charges were filed due to lack of evidence. What happened after that? I asked. The Whitakers were eventually committed to the state asylum, Mrs. Pembroke said, opening another folder. Their statements became increasingly disturbing. They claimed the entity continued to move through their house at night, searching for something. Eleanor Whitaker believed it was looking for another child to take. She showed me the commitment papers, which included excerpts from interviews with the couple. Thomas Whitaker had described seeing a patch of crawling darkness moving up the walls and across the ceiling of their home. Eleanor spoke of hearing scraping sounds at night and finding strange marks on the floors and walls. The house was sold at auction in 1914, Mrs. Pembroke continued. The new owners were a childless couple who lived there until 1931. They reported no unusual occurrences, though they did renovate extensively. Including sealing off part of the basement? I asked. She nodded. According to building permits from 1914, they walled off the northwest corner of the basement. No reason was given in the documentation. James's bedroom, I murmured. Was it ever determined what happened to him? No, she said. The case was never solved. Some believed the parents had killed him and invented the story as a cover. Others thought he might have run away, though he was quite young for that. His body was never found. I left the Historical Society with photocopies of the articles and documents, my mind racing. The rocking chair in the sealed room, had it been James's? Had the new owners walled it off because of the associations with the missing child, or for some other reason? And the dark, formless thing the Whitakers had described, was it the same low, crawling shadow I had glimpsed in my basement? That evening, I went through the documents again, looking for any additional details about the Whitakers' claims. One interview with Eleanor, conducted at the asylum, caught my attention. It lived in the darkness beneath our home, she had said. We should have known when James started speaking of the shadow that moves by itself. We thought it was a child's imagination. But after he was taken, we saw it too, crawling across the floor, up the walls, across the ceiling. It's looking for something. It won't stop until it finds it. I shivered, remembering the handprint-like smudge on my basement wall. 2 feet off the floor, the height a crawling entity might reach. That night, I made sure every light in the house was on before I went to bed. I even left the basement light burning, the door firmly closed. Despite these precautions, I found myself listening for sounds from below, tensing at every creak and groan of the old house. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of dark shapes moving just at the edge of my vision. I awoke suddenly, disoriented. The bedside clock read 3:17 a.m., the exact time I'd awakened 2 nights before. The house was silent, but something had disturbed my sleep. Then I noticed it, a subtle difference in the quality of light coming through my bedroom door, which I'd left ajar. The hallway seemed darker, as if something was blocking the light from the fixture I'd left on. As I watched, a shadow moved across the gap, not the shadow of a person walking past, but something lower, something that seemed to flow rather than walk. It passed the doorway and continued down the hall toward the stairs. I lay frozen, unable to move, unable to call out. My rational mind offered explanations, a trick of the light, an after-image from a dream, my own imagination working overtime after a day spent reading about the Whitakers' disturbing claims. But I knew what I had seen. I forced myself to get up, moving as quietly as possible to the doorway. The hallway was empty, the light casting normal shadows on the walls and floor. I listened intently but heard nothing unusual. Gathering my courage, I moved to the top of the stairs and looked down. The first floor hallway light illuminated the entryway and part of the living room. Nothing seemed out of place. I was about to return to my bedroom when I noticed something on the wall beside the basement door. A dark smudge similar to the one I'd seen in the basement, but higher up about 4 feet from the floor, as if something had paused there, resting against the wall before continuing. My breath caught in my throat. The entity, whatever it was, had come upstairs. The renovation had unsealed the room where it had perhaps been contained, or at least confined. Now it was free to move throughout the house just as the Whitakers had described. I spent the remainder of the night in the living room with every light on, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally came, I called Mike and told him I needed to take a break from the renovation for a few days. He seemed concerned but didn't press for details. After he hung up, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by the historical documents, trying to make sense of what was happening. The Whitakers had claimed something took their son, not killed him, but took him. They had seen it afterward moving through their home, searching. But searching for what? Another child, as Eleanor had believed? The house had passed through multiple owners since then, some with children, yet there were no other reports of disappearances. What made James special? And why had the entity returned now? I found myself drawn back to the newspaper accounts of James's disappearance. One detail caught my attention, a quote from a neighbor who had been interviewed. The boy was different, quiet-like, always staring at things none of us could see. His mother said he had an overactive imagination, but sometimes I wondered. Child who could see things others couldn't. A child who had spoken of a shadow that moves by itself before he vanished. I thought about the rocking chair we had removed from the sealed room. Had it been James's? Had he sat there, watching the shadow entity that his parents couldn't yet see? And then another thought struck me. What if the entity hadn't taken James? What if James had gone with it willingly? That night, despite my fear, I set a trap of sorts. I placed my phone on a shelf in the living room, set to record video throughout the night. I positioned it to capture most of the first floor, including the hallway and the basement door. Then I retreated upstairs to my bedroom, leaving a single light on in the hallway as I had the night before. Sleep eluded me for hours. Every sound, the house settling, the wind outside, the refrigerator cycling on and off, sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. But eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. I awoke to daylight streaming through my windows. No disturbances during the night, no glimpsed shadows or strange sounds. Perhaps whatever I had seen was gone now, or perhaps it had never been there at all. With a mix of relief and curiosity, I retrieved my phone and began reviewing the overnight footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Just the empty living room and hallway, occasionally disturbed by the shifting shadows of tree branches outside the windows. Then at 3:16 a.m. something changed. The quality of the light seemed to dim slightly, though none of the visible lights turned off. A darkness began to gather near the basement door, not a shadow cast by an object, but what appeared to be a concentration of darkness itself, forming into a low, amorphous shape. It moved across the hallway floor with that same crawling motion I had glimpsed before, but now I could see it clearly. It had no definite form, its edges constantly shifting and flowing, but it maintained a roughly oval shape about 3 feet long and half as wide. It left no visible marks on the floor, but where it passed, the light seemed to dim momentarily. The entity paused at the bottom of the stairs, seeming to gather itself. Then, impossibly, it began to flow up the wall beside the staircase, defying gravity, moving with the same undulating motion it had displayed on the floor. It disappeared from the camera's view as it ascended. A minute later, the hallway light upstairs dimmed noticeably, though it didn't go out completely. I fast-forwarded through the rest of the footage. At 4:23 a.m., the entity reappeared, flowing down the wall and across the hallway floor back to the basement door. It paused there, seeming to rear up slightly, reaching toward the doorknob. But without hands or any discernible appendages, it couldn't operate the mechanism. After several minutes, it flowed down to the gap beneath the door and seemed to compress itself, disappearing from view. I sat staring at my phone long after the video ended. There was no denying what I had seen. The crawling darkness the Whitakers had described was real, and it was in my house. But what did it want? Why had it gone upstairs? Was it searching for something, as Eleanor Whitaker had believed, or was it searching for someone? I spent that day researching entities associated with darkness and shadow in various mythologies and paranormal accounts. Most cultures had some version of shadow beings or darkness entities, often associated with thresholds between worlds or with the transition between life and death. Some accounts suggested these entities were malevolent, seeking to harm or possess the living. Others portrayed them as neutral observers or even guides, helping souls transition from one state to another. The Whitakers had believed the entity took their son. But what if it hadn't been an abduction in the traditional sense? What if James, who could see things others couldn't, had been special in some way? What if the entity had recognized that quality and offered him, what? A different existence? A transition to somewhere else? And now it was moving through my house at night, going upstairs, perhaps looking for James or for someone else with that same special quality. I didn't have children. I lived alone. What could it possibly want from me? That night, I decided on a different approach. Instead of hiding from the entity, I would observe it directly. I set up a chair in the hallway facing the basement door, with a small table beside it holding a flashlight, my phone set to record, and a notebook. I left a single lamp on at the far end of the hallway, providing enough light to see by without completely banishing the shadows. Then I waited. The house creaked and settled around me as the night deepened. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window slightly. I checked my watch repeatedly as the hours passed, 11 p.m., midnight, 1:30 a.m. At 3:15 a.m., I felt it before I saw anything. A subtle change in the air pressure, a heaviness that seemed to press against my skin. The light at the end of the hallway dimmed slightly, though the bulb continued to burn. Then I saw it. A patch of darkness near the basement door, darker than the surrounding shadows, gathering itself into that same amorphous shape I had seen in the video. It moved out into the hallway, flowing across the floor with its undulating, crawling motion. It stopped about 6 feet from my chair. I had the distinct impression it was observing me, though it had no visible eyes or face. The eye, darkness seemed to pulse slightly, expanding and contracting like slow breathing. "What are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The entity remained motionless for several long seconds. Then it began to change shape, elongating upward until it formed a column of darkness about 4 feet high. At the top, it developed a bulge that reminded me disturbingly of a head, though without features. It swayed slightly as if considering me. Then it began to move again, not toward me but toward the wall. It flowed up the vertical surface until the head-like bulge was level with a framed photograph hanging there, a landscape I'd put up when I first moved in. The darkness seemed to examine the photo, then move to the next frame, which contained an old map of the city I'd found at an antique store. It continued this way down the hallway, pausing at each picture, each decorative element, as if searching for something specific. When it reached the end of the hallway, it turned and came back, this time moving directly toward me. I gripped the arms of my chair, fighting the urge to flee. The entity stopped just beyond arm's reach, its form pulsing and shifting. Then, to my astonishment, it began to change shape again. The darkness condensed, forming a smaller silhouette, the unmistakable outline of a child, though still featureless and composed entirely of that same light-absorbing darkness. A boy. James Whitaker? Or a representation of him? The silhouette raised what would have been an arm, pointing toward the basement door. Then it collapsed back into its amorphous form and flowed rapidly across the floor, disappearing beneath the door. I sat frozen in my chair for several minutes, trying to process what I had witnessed. The entity had communicated, or at least It had attempted to. It had shown me a child's form and pointed to the basement. Was James still down there somehow? Or was there something else in the basement that the entity wanted me to find? Despite every instinct telling me to wait until daylight, I found myself standing, picking up my flashlight, and moving toward the basement door. Whatever answers existed were down there in the darkness. The basement was cold, the air heavy with dampness and the lingering scent of disturbed earth from the renovation. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the main space with its half-finished walls and exposed beams, then the opening to the formerly sealed room beyond. I approached cautiously, sweeping the light across the empty space where the rocking chair had been. Nothing seemed changed or disturbed, but as I turned to leave, my light caught something on the earthen floor, a disturbance in the dust that hadn't been there before. Moving closer, I saw it was a rough circle, about 3 feet in diameter, where the packed earth appeared to have been. Not dug up exactly, but loosened somehow, the surface broken and uneven. I knelt beside it, playing my light across the disturbed area. Something pale was visible among the dark earth, something smooth and curved. With trembling fingers, I brushed away some of the loose dirt, revealing what lay beneath. A bone, small and delicate, a child's bone. I scrambled backward, dropping my flashlight, which rolled across the floor, its beam creating wild shadows on the walls. When I retrieved it and directed the light back to the disturbed earth, I saw more. The unmistakable curve of a small skull partially emerged from the dirt. James Whitaker had never left the house. He had been here all along, buried beneath the floor of what had likely been his play area in the basement. But his parents had claimed he was taken by the crawling darkness. They had insisted they had seen the entity moving through their home afterward, searching. Had they been lying? Had they killed their son and invented the story as a cover, as some had suspected at the time? Or had something else happened? Something that involved both the entity and the boy's death? I backed out of the room, my mind racing. I needed to call the police, report the remains. But what would I tell them about how I had found them? That a shadow entity had led me to the grave? As I reached the bottom of the basement stairs, the light from my flashlight suddenly dimmed, then went out completely. I shook it, pressed the switch repeatedly, but it remained dark. In the absolute blackness that followed, I felt, rather than saw, the entity's return. A heaviness in the air, a pressure against my skin, a sense of something gathering in the darkness around me. Then, impossibly, I began to see it, not with my eyes, but with some other sense. The crawling darkness moved across the floor toward me, but now it was accompanied by another form, a small, human-shaped silhouette that walked beside it. A boy. They stopped a few feet away. The boy's shape seemed to be looking up at me, though. It had no visible face, just a darker density within the darkness, and suddenly I understood. The entity hadn't taken James, at least not in the way his parents had claimed. Something else had happened in this basement decades ago. Something that had resulted in the boy's death and burial. The entity had been present, had perhaps even been connected to James in some way, but it hadn't been the cause of his disappearance. It had been a witness, and now it had led me to the truth, to the hidden grave, to the evidence that would finally reveal what had really happened to James Whitaker in 1912. As if confirming my realization, both shapes, the crawling darkness and the boy silhouette, began to fade, becoming less distinct, less present. The pressure in the air eased. My flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the empty basement. They were gone. The police investigation that followed uncovered the full story, pieced together from the physical evidence and historical records. James Whitaker's remains showed signs of repeated physical abuse predating his death. The final blow, a fracture to the skull, had likely been delivered in the basement, after which his parents buried him beneath the earthen floor and invented the story of the dark and formless entity that had taken him. Their subsequent claims about seeing the entity moving through their house, searching for something, had been dismissed as madness born of guilt. But I knew differently. The crawling darkness was real. It had been present when James died, perhaps drawn to the threshold between life and death. And it had remained, moving through the house for decades, waiting for someone who could see it, someone who could help reveal the truth. After the investigation concluded, and James's remains were properly laid to rest in the town cemetery, I returned to the house, unsure if I could continue living there knowing what had happened. The basement renovation remained unfinished, the formerly sealed room now marked with police tape. That night I sat in the hallway again, waiting. But 3:17 a.m. came and went with no sign of the crawling darkness, no sense of that heavy presence in the air. The entity was gone, its purpose fulfilled. The truth about James Whitaker had been revealed, his remains found and properly buried. Whatever connection had existed between the boy and the darkness, whatever had kept it moving through the house for over a century, had been resolved. I decided to stay in the house, to complete the renovations, including the basement. The formerly sealed room became a workshop, filled with light and activity, the tragedy of its past acknowledged, but not allowed to define its future. Sometimes, on dark nights when the wind rattles the windows and the old house creaks and settles, I think I catch a glimpse of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow that moves independently, a darkness that seems deeper than it should be. But it never forms into that crawling entity again, never moves across my floors or up my walls. Instead, it's just a momentary impression, there and gone in an instant. A reminder, perhaps, that some thresholds remain thin, some connections never fully severed. And sometimes in those brief moments between wakefulness and sleep, I think I hear the soft creak of a rocking chair from somewhere deep in the house. A sound not of menace, but of peace. A boy at rest, his truth finally told, his long vigil ended. The crawling darkness has moved on. But the memory of what happened in the house on Blackwood Lane remains, a shadow of a different kind, imprinted on the very walls that witnessed it all. I've been a wilderness photographer for 15 years. I've captured images in some of the most remote locations on Earth. The depths of the Amazon, the heights of the Himalayas, the frozen expanses of Antarctica. I've encountered predators, survived extreme weather, and navigated treacherous terrain. But nothing in my experience prepared me for what happened in the Hoh rainforest last October. The assignment was straightforward: document the ancient temperate rainforest during its autumn transformation for a prominent nature magazine. The Hoh, located in Olympic National Park in Washington State, is one of the largest temperate rainforests in the U.S., with trees that have stood for centuries and moss so thick it muffles all sound. I'd planned a 2-week solo expedition, hiking deep into the less traveled areas to capture the primeval beauty of the forest. The first few days were productive, but uneventful. I established a base camp about 7 miles from the nearest trail, and spent my days photographing the interplay of light through the dense canopy, the vibrant mosses and fungi, the Roosevelt elk that moved like ghosts between the massive trees. It was on the 4th night that things changed. I'd been experimenting with long exposure night photography, capturing the way moonlight filtered through the canopy to create ethereal patterns on the forest floor. When I reviewed the images on my camera's display, I noticed something odd in one of the frames, a dark vertical shape at the edge of the clearing that I hadn't seen while shooting. I zoomed in as much as the camera would allow. The shape was unmistakably humanoid, a tall, slender silhouette standing perfectly still among the trees. I immediately scanned the forest with my headlamp, but saw nothing unusual, just the ancient trunks and the endless curtains of moss. Dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow, perhaps a peculiar arrangement of branches that only appeared human-like in the 2-dimensional space of a photograph. But that night, in my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day passed normally. I hiked to a small waterfall about a mile from camp, spending hours capturing the hypnotic flow of water over moss-covered stones. It wasn't until I returned to camp and reviewed the day's images that my unease returned. In 3 separate photos, all taken in different locations, the same dark silhouette appeared. Always at the periphery, always just barely in frame. always in places where I was certain no person had been standing. That night, I set up my camera on a tripod near my tent, programming it to take photos at 5-minute intervals throughout the night. I slept poorly, waking at every small sound, the crack of a branch, the call of an owl, the constant drip of moisture from the canopy above. When morning came, I reviewed the night's images with growing dread. The first few hours showed nothing unusual, just my small clearing gradually darkening as night fell. But around 2 a.m. they appeared, shadows. Not just one this time, but 3 distinct humanoid shapes standing at the edge of my camp. In subsequent images, their number increased. 5, 7, 12. And they were closer in each frame, having moved several feet toward my tent between shots. The final image, taken just before dawn, showed at least 20 shadow figures surrounding my camp, some merely feet from where I had been sleeping. Yet I had heard nothing, seen nothing with my own eyes. I packed up immediately, abandoning my carefully planned route in favor of the most direct path back to civilization. As I hiked, I obsessively checked each photo I took, finding more shadow, figures in the background of almost every image. They seemed to be following me, their numbers growing with each mile. By late afternoon, I reached the main trail, where I encountered a group of day hikers, the first people I'd seen in days. I must have looked as rattled as I felt, because one of them asked if I was all right. I mumbled something about not feeling well and continued toward the ranger station near the park entrance. Ranger Claire Simmons was on duty when I arrived, a veteran of the Park Service with over 20 years in Olympic National Park. When I explained why I'd cut my expedition short, I expected skepticism or concern for my mental state. Instead, she asked to see the photos. As she scrolled through the images on my camera, her expression changed from professional interest to something closer to recognition. She handed the camera back to me and closed the door to her office. "You're not the first," she said quietly, "though most people don't have such clear evidence." She explained that over her 2 decades at the park, she'd received dozens of reports from hikers, campers, and even fellow rangers who claimed to have seen shadowy figures in the deeper parts of the forest. Most were dismissed as imagination or misidentification of wildlife, but a few cases, including mine, couldn't be so easily explained away. "The local tribes have stories about them," she continued. "The Kino call them the Quiet People. They're said to inhabit a world parallel to our own, with the forest serving as a kind of membrane between realities. According to these legends, the Quiet People were neither malevolent nor benevolent toward humans, merely curious. They observed from their side of the threshold, occasionally becoming visible to those who spent enough time in the deep forest. But there's something else," Ranger Simmons added, her voice dropping further. "The elders say that sometimes the threshold between worlds can weaken. When that happens, the Quiet People gather at the thinning points, drawn by the possibility of crossing over." I showed her the sequence of night photos, pointing out how the figures had grown more numerous and moved closer to my camp over time. "I've never seen so many," she admitted, "and I've never seen them approach like this." She studied the final image again. "You need to speak with Joseph Running Elk. He's a Quinault elder who knows more about this than anyone. He lives just outside the park boundary." The next morning I drove to the address Ranger Simmons had given me. Joseph Running Elk was in his late 70s with dark eyes that seemed to evaluate me carefully as I explained my experience and showed him my photos. "They're gathering," he said simply after viewing the images. "The threshold is thinning." "What does that mean?" I asked. He gestured for me to follow him outside, where he pointed toward the distant outline of the rainforest. "Our world and theirs exist side by side, like 2 rooms separated by a wall. But the wall isn't solid everywhere. In some places, ancient places like the Ho, it's more like a curtain. Usually they can only look through this curtain, not pass through it." "And now the curtain is thinning?" I prompted. He nodded. "It happens sometimes when certain conditions align. The old stories say it occurs in cycles every few generations." "What conditions?" I asked. "Natural phenomena, certain alignments of stars, changes in the Earth's magnetic field, but also human activity." particularly the presence of certain individuals who act as catalysts. The way he looked at me made the implication clear. "You think I'm causing this?" I asked incredulously. "Not causing," he clarified. "Facilitating, perhaps. Some people have an energy about them that resonates with the threshold. They don't create the thinning, but they can accelerate it where it's already beginning." He asked detailed questions about my time in the forest, where exactly I'd camped, what I'd felt during my stay, whether I'd experienced unusual dreams. His final question caught me off guard. "Have you ever had encounters like this before? Not necessarily with shadow people, but with phenomena others couldn't see or experience?" I hesitated before answering. I'd never spoken about the incidents. From my childhood, the voices I'd heard in empty rooms, the figures I'd glimpsed from the corner of my eye. My parents had attributed it to an overactive imagination, and eventually I'd convinced myself of the same. Joseph nodded at my silence. "Some people are more sensitive to the threshold. They can perceive what exists between worlds without realizing what they're seeing." He explained that the quiet people weren't approaching my camp to threaten me. They were approaching the weakening threshold, which happened to be centered around my location. My presence was somehow accelerating a natural process. "Is it dangerous?" I asked. "This thinning?" "Not inherently," he said. "But anytime barriers between worlds weaken, there is potential for complications. The quiet people aren't the only entities that exist in the parallel world, and not all of them are merely curious." He recommended I stay away from the deep forest for at least a month, allowing the threshold to stabilize without my catalyzing presence. He also gave me a small leather pouch containing herbs and other materials I couldn't identify, instructing me to keep it with me at all times. "It won't prevent you from perceiving the threshold," he explained, "but it will prevent you from inadvertently weakening it further." I should have followed his advice completely. I should have stayed away from the forest entirely. But I'm a photographer, and the pull of potentially capturing something truly extraordinary was too strong to resist. I compromised, staying on the well-traveled main trails and only visiting during daylight hours. For a week, nothing unusual appeared in my photos. I began to wonder if the whole experience had been some strange psychological episode brought on by isolation in the deep forest. Then, reviewing images from a day shoot near the Ho River, I found them again. The shadow figures were back, but different now, more distinct, more substantial. In one image, I could make out facial features on the nearest figure, hollow eyes and a mouth frozen in what might have been either a smile or a grimace. I returned to Joseph immediately, showing him the new images. "They're becoming more defined," he said, his expression grave. "The threshold is still thinning, despite your precautions." He asked to see my camera, examining it closely. "Objects can become conduits," he explained, "especially objects that have been present during significant threshold events. Your camera was there when they gathered in large numbers. It may now be acting as a focal point." That night, I left my camera in Joseph's care. He planned to perform a cleansing ritual that would sever any connection between my equipment and the threshold. While waiting, I researched historical accounts of similar phenomena in the region. The Olympic Peninsula Library had a small but detailed collection of local indigenous histories and settler accounts. I found multiple references to shadow people, or forest watchers, dating back to the earliest European explorations of the area. One journal from an 1887 expedition described human-like silhouettes observed among the trees, visible only when not directly gazed upon. Most intriguing was an account from 1934, when a civilian Conservation Corps team was constructing trails in what would later become Olympic National Park. Their camp was allegedly surrounded by silent watchers for several nights. Shortly afterward, 3 workers disappeared without a trace. The official report attributed their disappearance to a landslide, but the journal of the camp supervisor suggested otherwise. "They have crossed over to where the watchers dwell. We hear their voices sometimes calling from just beyond the veil of moss and mist." When I returned to Joseph's home the next day, I found him sitting on his porch, my camera in his hands, his expression troubled. "The connection is stronger than I anticipated," he said. The cleansing had little effect. He showed me the photos he'd taken during the ritual, images I hadn't seen him capture. Each showed shadow figures in his home, surrounding the space where the ritual had been performed. But these weren't the indistinct silhouettes from my forest photos. These were detailed, almost solid-looking entities with clearly defined features. In the most disturbing image, one of them appeared to be reaching toward the camera, its elongated fingers just inches from the lens. "They're not just observing anymore," Joseph said. "They're attempting to interact. The threshold has thinned to the point where direct contact may be possible." "What do they want?" I asked. "To cross over, perhaps, or to draw others across to their side." He shook his head. "The old stories aren't clear on their intentions, only that when the threshold thins completely, movements can occur in both directions. He advised me to leave the peninsula entirely, to put as much distance as possible between myself and the Ho rainforest. The threshold was localized," he explained. "Its influence wouldn't extend beyond the Olympic Peninsula." I agreed, booking a flight back to my home in Colorado for the following morning. I spent that night in a Port Angeles hotel, my camera locked in the room safe. I didn't want to risk taking any more photos, didn't want to see what might appear in them. Sleep eluded me. Around 3 a.m., I became aware of a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The air felt thicker, charged somehow like the heaviness before a thunderstorm, and it was cold, much colder than it should have been, even with the Pacific Northwest's autumn chill. I lay perfectly still, eyes fixed on the ceiling, afraid to look around the room. But as the cold intensified, I couldn't resist turning my head toward the window. The curtains were open, though I distinctly remembered closing them before bed, and pressed against the glass from the outside was a face. Not a shadow this time, but a fully formed visage with hollow eyes and a mouth, stretched in that ambiguous expression between smile and grimace. Behind it, filling the parking lot below, were dozens more figures, all staring up at my third-floor window. I reached for my phone to call the front desk, to call Joseph, to call anyone, but stopped when I saw the screen. It displayed a photo I hadn't taken, my own sleeping face from earlier that night taken from inside my hotel room. I threw on clothes, grabbed my essential belongings, and ran for the door. The hallway was dark, emergency lights casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of any visible source. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, sprinting down 3 flights and bursting into the lobby. The night manager looked up in alarm. "Sir, is everything all right?" "Are there people in the parking lot?" I demanded. "A group of people just standing there." He frowned, moving to the front windows to check. "No, sir. The lot's empty except for the guests' vehicles." I moved beside him, looking out at the now vacant parking lot. No figures, no faces at windows, nothing unusual at all. "Maybe a bad dream?" the manager suggested kindly. "We can send up some tea if you'd like." I declined, returning to my room only long enough to retrieve my camera from the safe. Dream or not, I wasn't spending another minute in that hotel. I drove through the night, heading east away from the peninsula, not stopping until I reached Seattle. From there, I caught my scheduled flight to Denver, then drove straight to my mountain cabin, as far from rainforests as I could reasonably get. For weeks, I didn't touch my camera. It sat in a drawer, battery removed, memory card extracted and stored separately. I tried to convince myself that what had happened was some combination of isolation, sleep deprivation, and suggestion after hearing the local legends. Eventually, curiosity overcame caution. I needed to know if the hotel incident had been real or imagined. I inserted the memory card into my computer, bracing myself for what I might find. There were no photos from the hotel room, no image of me sleeping, nothing to suggest anything had happened there at all. Relief washed over me, followed quickly by doubt. Had I imagined the entire experience? I scrolled through the older images, my documentation of the shadow figures in the forest, their gradual approach toward my camp. They were still there, still inexplicable. And then I noticed something I'd overlooked before. In the final image from that night sequence, the one showing 20 or more figures surrounding my tent, There was a subtle difference from what I remembered. The shadows weren't facing my tent as I'd initially thought. They were facing away from it, looking outward, forming a circle around my camp. They hadn't been approaching me. They had been surrounding me, protecting me. I called Joseph running, elk that evening. When I described what I'd noticed, he was silent for a long moment. The threshold works both ways, he finally said. Just as they can potentially cross to our world, other things from our world can cross to theirs. Things that perhaps should not. What kinds of things? I asked. Human consciousness, for one, he replied. The quiet people may have been gathering, not to cross over themselves, but to prevent something else from crossing in the opposite direction. My consciousness? You think I was in danger of crossing over? Perhaps not intentionally, he said, but your sensitivity to the threshold, combined with the thinning that was already occurring. You may have been at risk of what the old stories call slipping through, your awareness crossing over while your body remained here. He explained that such occurrences were rare, but documented in tribal histories. Individuals whose minds somehow transferred to the parallel world while their physical forms became empty vessels. The body doesn't die, he said, but it no longer houses the original consciousness. It becomes available. Forest shadows continued. Available for what? I asked, though part of me already suspected the answer. For occupation, Joseph said, gravely. The quiet people cannot physically cross the threshold in their own forms. But if a human consciousness slips through to their side, it creates a vacancy, an opportunity for one of them to cross over by inhabiting the empty vessel left behind. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You're saying they could have taken over my body if my consciousness had crossed over? It's one possibility, he acknowledged, though the old stories suggest it rarely happens. More often, both sides work to prevent such crossings. The balance between worlds must be maintained. That explained the protective circle around my tent. The shadow figures hadn't been threatening me. They'd been creating a barrier, ensuring I remained firmly anchored in my own reality while the threshold was dangerously thin. But why was I at risk in the first place? I asked. Why would my consciousness be prone to slipping through, as you call it? Joseph's response was measured, as if he'd been considering this question himself. Some humans naturally resonate with the threshold. Often they're individuals who've had one foot in both worlds since childhood, people who've glimpsed things others can't see, heard things others can't hear. My childhood experiences, the voices, the glimpsed figures that my parents had dismissed as imagination. These people are drawn to threshold places, he continued, often unconsciously. They become photographers, explorers, rangers, roles that allow them to spend time in ancient forests, caves, mountains, places where the membrane between worlds has always been thinner. It made an unsettling kind of sense. My entire career had been built around seeking out the most remote, primeval landscapes on Earth, places untouched by modern human influence, where ancient energies might still flow undisturbed. What about the hotel? I asked. What I saw in Port Angeles, was that real? Distance helps, but doesn't immediately sever the connection once it's established, Joseph explained. The threshold's influence can follow those who've become attuned to it, at least for a while. What you saw may have been a final attempt at contact before the connection faded. He advised me to stay away from threshold places for at least a year to allow any residual connection to fully dissipate. He also suggested certain protective practices, meditation techniques, and simple rituals that would help strengthen the boundaries of my own consciousness. I followed his advice diligently. For 6 months, I took only commercial photography jobs in urban settings, avoiding wilderness work entirely. The strange experiences ceased. No shadow figures appeared in my photos, no faces pressed against my windows at night. Eventually, I began to wonder if I'd overreacted. Perhaps Joseph's interpretations, while offered in good faith, were colored by cultural beliefs that didn't necessarily reflect objective reality. Perhaps there was a scientific explanation for what I'd captured in my photos, some unusual light phenomenon or equipment malfunction. That rationalization led me to accept a short assignment photographing winter landscapes in Rocky Mountain. National Park, wild, yes, but not a known threshold place according to Joseph's descriptions. Just 3 days of shooting, staying on marked trails, never alone. The first 2 days were productive and uneventful. On the third morning, I ventured slightly off-trail to capture a pristine field of snow with a perfect mountain backdrop. As I framed the shot, I noticed something odd in my viewfinder, a dark vertical shape at the edge of a distant stand of pines. My finger froze above the shutter button. Slowly, I lowered the camera and looked directly at the spot where I'd seen the shape. Nothing unusual was visible to my naked eye. I raised the camera again. The figure was still there in the viewfinder, a humanoid silhouette standing perfectly, still among the trees. As I watched, a second figure appeared beside it, then a third. But something was different about these figures. They weren't the indistinct shadows from the Hoh rainforest. These had definition, substance. And they were moving with purpose, emerging from the trees and heading directly toward me across the snowfield. I lowered the camera again. The snowfield remained empty to my unaided vision. Camera up, figures approaching, now halfway across. The field, camera down. Nothing but pristine snow. Camera up. The figures almost upon me. Details becoming visible. Hollow eyes, stretched mouths, reaching hands. Camera down. Empty landscape. I backed away, nearly stumbling in my haste. These weren't the quiet people from the Hoh. These entities moved with intent, with hunger. And they were using my camera, my connection to the threshold, to approach. I turned and ran back to the trail, to the safety of other hikers and the tangible, undeniable reality they represented. I didn't stop until I reached the visitor center, where I sat in the crowded cafeteria, surrounded by tourists and park staff, my camera stowed deep in my backpack. That evening, I called Joseph Running Elk. "Not all threshold places are the same," he said after I described what had happened. "And not all entities beyond the threshold are the quiet people. Some places harbor different presences. But I only saw them through the camera," I pointed out. "In the Hoh, they eventually became visible to the naked eye. Your camera has become a lens to the threshold," he explained. "A tool that allows you to perceive what exists between worlds more clearly than your unaided senses, but that also makes it a potential doorway." He strongly advised me to dispose of the camera, not sell it or give it away, but destroy it completely. The connection it had formed to the threshold made it dangerous, not just to me, but potentially to anyone who might use it after me. I was reluctant. It was an expensive piece of equipment, and more importantly, it contained the only evidence of what I'd experienced. Without those images, I might eventually convince myself none of it had happened. We compromised. Joseph knew a Ute elder in Colorado who was experienced in cleansing objects connected to threshold phenomena. I would take the camera to him, undergo a more comprehensive ritual than what Joseph had attempted, and then decide whether to keep or destroy it based on the results. 2 days later, I met with Daniel Stonehorse at his home outside of Boulder. He was older than Joseph, well into his 80s, with eyes that seemed to evaluate layers of reality beyond what was immediately visible. He examined my camera without touching it, then asked to see the images I'd captured in the Hoh rainforest. As he viewed them on my laptop, his expression remained neutral, but I noticed his hands tighten slightly on the arms of his chair. "These are the quiet people," he confirmed, "but they are agitated, more present than they should be. The threshold was very thin where you were." When I described what I'd seen in Rocky Mountain National Park, his expression darkened. "Different entities," he agreed. "The quiet people observe. These others hunt." The cleansing ritual took place that night in a small ceremonial space behind his home. It involved elements I recognized: sage smoke, prayer, the careful application of various substances to my camera, and others I didn't understand, including a long period where Daniel spoke in his native language to seemingly empty air. Throughout the ritual, I felt a growing heaviness in the atmosphere, a pressure that made my ears pop and my skin prickle. At one point, the smoke from the ceremonial fire began to behave strangely, forming distinct shapes before dissipating, shapes that resembled the figures from my photos. When it was over, Daniel handed me the camera. "The connection is severed," he said, "but a trace remains like a scar. It can be reopened more easily than a fresh connection can be formed." He advised me to use the camera only in populated areas, never in remote wilderness, and never at night or during transitional times like dawn and dusk when the threshold naturally thins. "And you," he added, fixing me with those penetrating eyes, "you must decide what relationship you want with the threshold. Your awareness of it cannot be erased. Now that you've perceived it, that perception will remain part of you." "What are my options?" I asked. "You can avoid threshold places entirely, minimizing the risk of further encounters. You can learn to protect yourself and move carefully in these places, accepting that you will perceive things others cannot. Or you can study the threshold deliberately, with proper guidance." I chose the middle path. I couldn't abandon wilderness, photography entirely. It was both my livelihood and my passion. But I had no desire to become a threshold researcher, deliberately seeking out encounters with whatever existed in that in-between state. In the years since then, I've developed a careful practice. I research locations thoroughly before visiting, consulting with local indigenous experts about the history and spiritual significance of the areas. I carry protective items recommended by both Joseph and Daniel. I never photograph at night in remote locations, and I always travel with at least one companion in areas known for threshold phenomena. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts. When the air changes texture, when sounds become muffled, when that feeling of being observed intensifies, I leave immediately. No photograph is worth the risk of weakening the threshold further. I've had no direct encounters with shadow figures since that day in Rocky Mountain National Park. But occasionally, reviewing images taken in certain ancient forests or remote mountains, I'll notice something at the very edge of the frame, a slight darkening, a vertical shape that could almost be a tree trunk or rock formation but isn't, a reminder that the quiet people are still there, still watching from their side of the threshold. Sometimes I wonder what they see when they look at our world. Are we as mysterious to them as they are to us? Do they study our movements, our behaviors, our interactions with the same curiosity we direct toward them? And what happens in those rare instances when the threshold thins completely? When the boundaries between worlds dissolve, even momentarily? I may never know. But I've come to believe that the threshold serves a purpose, that the separation between worlds exists for good reason. Some boundaries are meant to be respected, not crossed. Some shadows are meant to remain at the edges of our perception, glimpsed but never fully encountered. The forest shadows have their world. We have ours. And the threshold between, that liminal space where realities touch but don't quite merge, is perhaps best left undisturbed. But I keep the photographs from the Hoh rainforest. Evidence, yes, but also a reminder. A reminder that our understanding of reality is incomplete, that ancient wisdom sometimes contains truths modern science has yet to comprehend, and that some things can be simultaneously real and impossible, visible only when we're willing to look at the world through a different lens. Thanks for staying with us until the very end. If you enjoyed tonight's chilling tales, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that keep you up at night. Share your favorite part in the comments. We're always watching, and remember, at Nocturnal Narrative Studio, the night never truly ends.